Welcome to Interview Reenactment Theater. What you're about to listen to is an interview conducted in 1995 between Next Generation magazine and then U.S. Senator Joseph Lieberman. In the mid-1990s, Senator Lieberman was making a name for himself by suggesting that violent media, including games like Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers, were causing real-world violence. Unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of facts to back up these claims, making this interview with Next Generation magazine especially interesting. Sadly, there's no audio of this conversation on the internet, and the printed interview is only available via a magazine that hasn't been in circulation for 2 decades. But we at Defunct Games feel it's vitally important to preserve these interviews. That way, future generations can learn from our past mistakes. For tonight's episode, I will be playing the part of Next Generation magazine. Joe Lieberman will be played by Daniel Santos, the Miami-based critic behind ShintaiReviews. Curiously, he appears to have been bitten by Frank Underwood right before recording this interview. In any event, what you're about to listen to is a real interview that was published in a nationally distributed magazine. We hope you enjoy this episode of Interview Reenactment Theater. Hello, Senator Lieberman. I'm happy that you joined us today. So, what is it that you're trying to do?
Okay. Well, for me, this started out not politically, but personally. In fact, it started out more with television than with video games. I was watching my daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, watching television, and I saw that TV had changed a lot in the kid hours in terms of the content from when her siblings had been watching TV. This was around 4 years ago. My chief of staff and I were talking about this, and he was telling me that he was having an argument with his son, who was then 8 or 9, about Mortal Kombat. The kid wanted it, but my chief of staff didn't want to buy it for him. We watched it, and I thought it was, let's just say I was struck by the violence. I was struck by the graphic nature of the violence and by the extra dimension of the kids being involved in the violence. Kids playing these games are participants. Kids watching television are observers.
And this struck you as a key difference between violence on television and violence in video games?
Yeah, and the idea that in these video games, kids are being rewarded for the violence. The better they are at it, the better they do in the game. Anyway, this led me and Senator Cole, who was also interested in all this at the same time, to get together and hold the first video game hearings.
Right, and this was in December of 1993 when you described violent video games as, quote, the nightmare before Christmas, end quote. What were you hoping to achieve at this point?
Our goal was and is to do 2 things. Our first goal was to better inform parents and kids who are concerned about content, what was inside the games. And that's been the function of the rating system. Our second goal was to appeal to the video game makers, just as we appealed to the television producers, to rap music producers, to movie producers, to consider the impact of the games on those who are playing them. We'd like these people to draw their own lines over which they'll not go as to what they will and will not include in the stuff they produce. Hopefully because they're concerned about the impact on game players' behavior, particularly children.
Your argument, and your request for the video game industry to act, assumes that exposure to violence in video games is somehow harmful.
Right. Underneath all this is the conclusion that people who play violent video games, particularly children who play violent video games, probably will have a tendency to be more violent, or at least less struck by violence in real life. For some people, violence may be more acceptable or even normal for them in day-to-day life because of their experience with violence in video games.
Okay, but what research is this belief based on?
There isn't much, but there is some research on the impact of video games on kids. At one of the hearings that Senator Cole and I did, there was an expert who came out and mentioned a few studies that had been done. But really, the basis of our argument is the hundreds, actually I guess maybe over 2,000 studies on the impact of violent movies on children. In controlled environments, it has been shown that children watch violent movies or violent TV. Their behavior is affected. And there's even more anecdotal testimony from parents who told me that they've watched their kids' behavior be affected by playing video games.
But many of these reports and experiments simply test for anxious or hostile behavior immediately after watching violence on television. And these symptoms are a common result of any activity that causes a rush of adrenaline. A roller coaster ride or a healthy game of touch football would probably yield the exact same results. It's hardly damning evidence against video games. But you accept that there probably hasn't been enough specific research completed on the effects of violent video games, and instead borrow research from other fields. You're confident, then, that the research that exists, when bolstered by the conclusion of studies investigating the effects of violent content on television and anecdotal evidence from yourself and other parents, is enough evidence against video games to warrant action?
Yeah, I do. That's right. Just forget the studies for a minute and look at the money that's invested in television advertising. It's invested, I assume, because the advertisers, the people who are spending all the money, feel that what people see on television affects their behavior. They've got to believe that they can use TV to make people watching it have a desire for the product and consume it.
And you think it's safe to take this principle and argue that video games advertise violence?
Well, I think it's logical to develop a feeling about the impact of participation in video games for which the participants are actually rewarded for violence, for interactive experiences in which you win by killing. It's a much more active participation than that experienced by the couch potato watching television.
Sure, but we still don't have any real proof.
I think you've got to remember what it is that we're asking. It wasn't on the basis of this analysis that I was proposing that we make violent video games illegal. If I was, then one could appropriately ask, well, what's your evidence? And we would have to come up with something more concrete. But we're not trying to make them illegal. We basically tried to do two things. First, we're asking for a kind of disclosure or truth in advertising to let people know before they buy what's in the package. This is where the ratings on the boxes come from. Second, we want to simply to be advocates for this point of view, as we were when Senator Cole, Dr. Walsh, and I did this press conference last December in which Dr. Walsh released a list of the video games that he felt were too violent. We were there getting a little bit of attention, saying to the video game industry, hey, take a look at these games here and consider whether or not you want to put stuff like this out.
So aside from such freak instances as Lee Jacobson of DigiFX Interactive criticizing Dr. Walsh's list for not including its Harvester game, which he claims to be more violent than any of the games on the list, do you feel that your message to the video game industry is getting through?
Overall, I feel positively about the way the industry has responded. I'd like to see a few less truly violent video games. The ratings have been quite responsibly applied. And of course, the retailers have been very helpful, particularly the large ones, who have said that they wouldn't carry unrated games.
You argue that because video games ask players to participate in the violence, as opposed to simply observe it, and because successful participation is rewarded and encouraged, that playing a violent video game is somehow more harmful than watching violent TV. And this may be true, but on the other hand, the images seen in video games is far more primitive than what you see on TV. Most of the time, the victims of violence in video games is obviously not real people. Usually, they're just cartoon characters. Doesn't this reduce video games' potential harm?
Sure, it lessens somewhat, but of course the gap between video games and TV is lessening as technology improves. With each new game, it seems that the experience becomes so much more realistic and lifelike.
But isn't violence part of every human? And won't children always have a propensity to explore it? Kids have always played and been fascinated by violence, be it cowboys and Indians, toy soldiers, watching WWF on TV, or now playing Mortal Kombat. Hopefully, with the right guidance from parents and other adults, children will grow out of this violent phase. But you'll never be able to get rid of it altogether. It's as much part of growing up as teenage crushes. Surely, if we removed all violent video games, wouldn't children simply explore violence through other avenues?
Well, that's a fair and reasonable question. And sure, violence is part of our nature. Cain killed Abel a long time ago. But the question is, what do we do about it? I mean, do we try to control it? Or do we create a climate in which it is encouraged, in which it is rewarded, in which it is more acceptable?
So you believe that violent video games are part of a bigger problem?
Right. I really view this problem in a cumulative sense. That is, I'm not worried just by the violent video games that kids are playing, but by the fact that these games exist in the context of an entertainment culture in which movies are violent, television is increasingly violent, and some of the music is horrendously violent. And it is all of this together, I think, that is sending a very bad message to kids. I'm never going to pin the blame just on video games, as we've just said about the inherent nature of humans. A lot of people are violent, and indeed the species is violent by nature, so it's not video games or the entertainment culture that cause the violence. But my worry is that the accumulation of messages our kids are getting about the acceptability of violence and about the thrill of violence contributes to making our society more violent than it would otherwise be.
Another fundamental question is whether or not video games, by offering a means for kids to explore violence, provides a harmless outlet for their natural aggressions or feed a natural hunger for violent behavior, a hunger that will grow and grow.
I think my sense, and again it's validated, or at least it's encouraged by the studies that do exist with television and movie violence, and by the anecdotal evidence from parents and kids, is that the effect of violent video games has been to feed the hunger and to drive the yearning. Violent video games drive this violent side of human nature to be larger than it would otherwise be.
But at least while playing video games, the situation is controlled. When exploring violence through a violent video game, usually the following is true. 1. The child is in the safety of his home, with no risk to actual physical injury to himself or others. 2. His success or failure in the game relies not on physical size or brute strength, but on more cerebral factors, such as quick thinking and memory. And 3. Playing video games can actually offer such benefits as enhanced hand-eye coordination and spatial reasoning. So, given that kids will always want to explore violence, aren't video games a fairly safe way to facilitate it?
A fascinating argument, and one we used to hear in defense of sexually provocative movies, but I don't think it works that way.
We would like to thank Senator Joseph Lieberman for taking the time to meet with Next Generation Magazine. We would also like to thank Next Generation Magazine for running this interview in the first place. And while I'm at it, I would like to thank Daniel Santos. Make sure and check out his YouTube reviews and interviews at ShintaiReviews. After this interview, Joseph Lieberman decided to take his anti-game platform and run for President of the United States of America. He never got past the primaries by himself, but was tapped by Al Gore to be the running mate on the 2000 Democratic Party ticket. Senator Lieberman left office in 2013, and while we still use a rating system, just like Joe championed, I suspect the former senator was disappointed that video games only became more violent, not less. On the other hand, perhaps he'll take solace in the knowledge that real-world violence has decreased as the popularity of video games has increased. These days, many other people have spoken out against video game violence. However, both studies and evidence suggest that Next Generation magazine was right. It's better to get your aggressions out on the TV screen. Thank you again for listening, and join us next week for another reenactment. For more information, articles, and reviews, please check out defunctgames.com. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter @defunctgames.